At the end, when we turn around and say, okay, federal government has given us this one-time influx of funding, what do we have to show for it? What changed? How are we providing different experiences? Yes, some of it's going to be used to be plugging holes, which from a budget end is very worrisome, but you get it at this point. How are we strategic? Because every dollar that we use comes out of somebody's pocket somewhere. We need to be strategic with that so we can look back in 2025 and say, here's some things that we fundamentally shifted because of that influx of money. And ultimately, here's how we made it sustainable.
That's Tom Murray, and he's the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools. In fact, you might have seen him at a conference as he's a regular keynote speaker. He was named one of 20 to watch by the NSBA, the National Global EdTech Leader of the Year in 2018, and the Education Thought Leader of the Year in 2017. His last two books, Leading Transformed and Personal and Authentic, have both reached bestseller status, and he's here with us today to talk about what it means to be future ready. How do you navigate change? It's a question we think about often, and one that today's world expects us to be comfortable with. The challenge, however, is where do you begin, and how do you develop the mindset and skills to be successful? You're listening to Designing Schools, and I'm your host, Dr. Saba Kidwai, educator, researcher, and storyteller. Join me each week for stories and strategies that bridge the gap between research and practice, as together we explore how might we design schools. There's no doubt that every organization struggled during the pandemic. However, some organizations fared far better than others. This was mostly as a result of leaders who had recognized the need early on to evolve and had put forth a vision, implemented systems and policies, created access to technology, and had environments that were primed for the turbulent world that we knew was rapidly changing. I remember thinking every time I read about a school that was managing well, they seemed to have one thing in common. They were part of the Future Ready Schools network. So I begin there with Tom. What does it mean to be future ready? And what qualities allowed these leaders to design future ready organizations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Quite an honor to be on the podcast. I get that question a lot, and I think it's a logical question. Like, what am I signing up for? What is this all about? What does this mean? What do I have to buy? What's the bottom line? How much does it cost, right? Get all those kinds of questions. So when we talk about being future ready, first and foremost, it really is about a mindset of prioritizing our learners first and foremost, and then optimizing the conditions that they need to be able to thrive. It is equity focused. When we take a look at how we prioritize the work that we do, really starts with leadership and school culture. We recognize this isn't about checking a box. It's not about saying I've got these 5 things in place. I'm a future ready school forever moving forward. That's not how we define it or look at it. It's really looked at as this work in progress. How do we build leadership capacity and human capital to transform the system to be relevant for today's modern learners? And what does that look like? The Future Ready framework is a really great backbone for all of that. We spend a lot of time researching what are the big bucket areas of transformation that districts have to focus on. Whereas if they also forget one of them, things can come crumbling down real quick. So let me just run through those very quick. We talk about being future ready. We really look at the big gear areas of the framework. One being curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Obviously, the heart and soul of what we do is the teaching and learning side. For us, we're not here to say, buy this curriculum or buy that canned whatever. How do we make sure we're creating learning experiences that are for today's learners so that when they go off, they can really live life on their own terms? What do those experiences look like? The second gear is personalized professional learning. I'll tell you, we don't call it professional development. Reason being is like, look up any study on professional development. What do people think of? It's the sit and get one size fits all hours-based accountability. What do we know about professional learning? Like, that's not what works. So we're not going to do that, right? And learning's the heart and soul of what we do. I've never heard somebody get up in the morning and say like, I can't wait to be developed today, right? And so we call that personalized professional learning to make sure that we're shifting our system so it's relevant for our teachers. We're going to talk about making learning more personal in nature. We have to model the same as administrators through the professional learning process, recognizing some of the best people to lead it are teaching in our classrooms each and every day. The next gear to look at real quick is budget and resources. In one word, I would say sustainability, making sure that the things that we're investing in now are sustainable long-term. We look at community partnerships. How do we engage our community? How do we engage places of worship or businesses? Such great work happening in pathways and those types of things, tying in businesses and our community partnerships and recognizing this is really about our community's kids. Another one is data and privacy. As we've done so much that's remote, privacy continues to rise to the forefront. This isn't about lock and block. It's about how do we make sure that all the information that we have on students is remaining private. And privacy is a non-negotiable, and it really comes down to trust. And so how do we build that? What are some tools and resources for that? Robust infrastructure is another one. When we look at the height of the pandemic, the notion of access and home access really came to the forefront. Districts have invested a lot of money in that area. Another one's also the use of space and time. When we talk about learning spaces, what does that look like? We're not talking about being pretty for Pinterest. We're talking about how does design impact learning, impact the brain, and how do we optimize conditions like that in the classroom? The other piece being the use of time, and how can we use time differently in that work? All surrounded by collaborative leadership. And we talk about leadership, we're not talking about title. We're talking about action. Some of the greatest leaders we know in schools, those that are teaching in classrooms, some of our support staff members, that 35-year veteran, and sometimes that 3-year veteran leading the way. So that's just a quick overview of the Future Ready framework, but some of the big bucket areas we talk about creating future ready schools. Yeah, it's really interesting. I can remember that March 13th, I was standing in Wyoming. I was working with a school district, and the superintendent pulled me aside and said, Tom, governor's going to make an announcement. We're not sure if we're going to bring these folks back next week, what it's going to look like. And bam, by the way, remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Like, how did that all work out for us, right? Like the chaos of that ensued. And on that Friday, the 13th, I think about all the thoughts, and I love bringing educators back to that reflection point of all the fears, all the thoughts, all the what ifs. Like, how are we going to teach kindergarten if they have to be home? Like, what about kids that don't have access? What's that going to look like? And all these questions that have to be answered. First thing I want to do is recognize the greatness of educators, how they shifted on a dime. Is everything perfect? Of course not. But finding a way to be able to shift things and turn things around. The other piece that I'll bring about is my own personal experience in the district that I was at. Part of the reason that I was tied to what became Future Ready Schools is one of our other kind of babies in where I work is Digital Learning Day. And the reason I share that is on the second Digital Learning Day, my team where I was in a public school in Pennsylvania was highlighted because 13 years ago, we created our own virtual program taught by our teachers with our content to provide ultimate flexibility for our students. So students at the high school level could come in for 2 periods a day. They could leave for the rest of the day. And that was 13 years ago. I don't say that out of ego or pride. I say that because when that pandemic hit, that's what people started to say, oh my gosh, how in the world are we going to do this virtually? What's it going to be? I will say in reflection, it took us where I was about 3 years, by the way, not 1 or 2 in-service days before it, 3 years to get it to the point of high quality teaching and learning, a point that I was really content with it, thinking that we were cruising along, kids were having a great experience. And so number one, I want to recognize all the things educators did do to shift on a dime, and kudos for that. But number two, I want to recognize the complexity of what we were trying to do at such a high level. And so when I think back through that, the other piece was we've also been pushing the home access, something we've already talked about multiple times here. We've been pushing that now for 7 years. We've been using some of the same examples of community partnerships and how districts are leveraging their community with hotspots and connecting with businesses. And none of those things are perfect end-all be-all solutions, but really pointing out in the very early part of the pandemic, we released at Future Ready the very first state-by-state breakdown of numbers of students that did not have internet access. And it was about 16.9 million kids. Disproportionately, it was our Black and brown students. And so my question was this, on that March 13th, it became front and center where it became a non-negotiable. If we're going to ask kids to do something digital outside of school, they've got to be connected, right? Now, a lot of times it's the economic issue, but sometimes it's a really rural issue. You can hand them a hotspot and it's a paperweight, doesn't do them any good. But my question was, why do we care as much about that on March 11th? Now, some districts did. We've been preaching it for 7 years because of it, because pre-pandemic, about 70% of our teachers were asking kids to do something digital and 16.9 million couldn't. So here's my point of view right now. When we think about it, 2 years into the pandemic, we want to know what your district really feels about equity. So we recognize the need now. We recognize the kids don't have the home access. Now we're back in person across the board for the most part. Did we pull all those hotspots back? Because now we're saying, I recognize you have the need, but hey, good luck, you're on your own. And we're going to still continue to do things digital outside of school. Fortunately, there's a lot of funding through the FCC, which we work with a lot behind the scenes, through states, through some of the ARP funding to be able to support the exact need we're talking about. Because it's been front and center, one of the questions that we have moving forward is, will we keep that front and center now that we've recognized the need, called out the need? And that need's not just going away. But fortunately, there's been a lot of support, even on both sides of the aisle, to support that. So a couple inflection points there, a couple key pieces, but going back to the future ready leaders, it comes down to superintendents that are willing to buck the trend, superintendents that are willing to say, here's a non-negotiable. This is part of my core, part of what I believe in. Pre-pandemic, superintendents had about a 3.5-year tenure in the average district. That's going down. I don't know projections on that. I'd say it's less than 3 years in the average district. So part of that's a challenge because you push hard, too fast. You can get a board that in one night, one vote, like you're out, you're done. But the same sense is the superintendents that probably referring to, and many of them that are leveraging and telling their story on social media, so many of those pieces also recognize here's an area that's non-negotiable for me as a superintendent. I'm going to do whatever I need to for those students, but they're also really good community builders. It's not that they're just going up against their board saying, you will listen to me and this is what we're going to do. They build consensus, they build community within their organizations for that sustainability. It's not just somebody saying, listen to me because I'm the boss. It's somebody saying, here's what our kids need and working really hard to get those folks on board. I'm so proud of the things that we saw when that pandemic hit because of things that they had prioritized in the framework, because of the access, the opportunity, leveraging technology to help level that playing field, that we were able to see that they were much further ahead. So many of the things that happened were things that we had talked about in institutes and kind of that visioning and strategic planning. And so I'm really proud of the leadership and the vision that they had to be when that crisis hit and we didn't know it was coming, they were really well prepared.
There's two things in particular that I really like that Tom just shared with us. First, the idea that it starts with culture, and culture starts with community. It's one of the reasons why I love social influence and being able to share your story, and we'll get into that a little bit later with Tom. But that truly is one of the ways in which you can really, really create that community. It's one of the reasons why I, as an outsider, was able to see what was happening in all these different organizations. The other thing that I really like that Tom shared is how do we design schools and create experiences where learners can live life on their own terms? It's one of the most fascinating things about the world that we live in. There's so many possibilities and so many opportunities, yet not everyone knows that they exist. And worse off, not everyone knows how to access those opportunities. In a world that's constantly changing, there's really one thing that can be a constant for you, and that's mindset. And it's one of the reasons why I gravitate so much towards design thinking. It's why I advocate for people to practice design thinking, whether it's in your leadership teams, whether it's in your classrooms, whether it's in your personal lives. Because through practicing design thinking, we really begin to nurture those mindsets within ourselves over time. You can't just do a lesson on creative confidence or a lesson on empathy or a lesson in learning from failure. You have to really be reflective and really think about these mindsets through ongoing experiences. And mindset is the one thing that Tom highlights for us as well. However, one of the things that we know as adults is that often when it comes to mindset, there's so many things we have to unlearn before we can relearn new things. So I asked Tom to share, what does he see people having to unlearn as they shift their mindset as leaders?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I love learning sciences and I love recognizing how the brain is wired. When we do that, we're wired for comfort, we're wired for safety, which is the exact opposite of what we need when it comes to leadership and transforming the system. We're not wired to just run out and take risks and jump and try new things because our brain says, no, that's not going to be safe, right? That's survival instinct. And so when we think about it, sometimes that mindset shift of not doing the way it was done to us. Many times we talk to teachers, we can do studies and surveys, and so many times we're comfortable with the way we experienced it, right? And some of us had great experiences where it was very hands-on and engaging. Others of us, it was the complete opposite of that. And so sometimes it's unlearning what we've experienced to create something that's new, different, more relevant for today's modern learners. And so I think just the teaching and learning side of it as a whole, again, some of us had some great experiences, but how do we move past that traditional kind of one size fits all, sit and get point-based system, kind of sort and select? There's so many facets of it there that really should and need to be redesigned. Love the work you're doing in that area there as well, truly. And so I think those are just some quick examples. Another piece that we see really coming to the forefront at Future Ready Schools, we've been leading a lot of equity work nationally for a good 7 years now. part of it is recognizing your own lens. Each of us has our own lens just from life, the way we grew up, the parent structure. Some of us grew up in poverty, some of us grew up in extreme wealth, some of us somewhere in between, right? And so we know what we've experienced in life. And what I recognize is taking a look at how do you step out of your own experience and also have empathy for experiences that you've never experienced, but many of your students come to in a given day. So we talk about that future ready mindset, or we talk about having to unlearn things. It's stepping out of your own box to recognize the students that we're serving are coming from so many different places. How do we respect that? How do we celebrate those differences, but also honor those to be able to move forward and create experiences that are relevant for them as well?
We're wired for comfort and safety, says Tom. This is true for every single person within and outside of your organization. How do you step outside your experience to empathize with the students or people that you're designing for? We've all changed so much over the past 2 years, as learners, as educators, as leaders, and just as humans. If you're subscribed to the blog, you'll know that I've been doing a series reflecting on the work I did when I was the Director of Innovative Learning at the University of Southern California. I share the difference in our approach when we listened to students and designed with them instead of for them. One year, a unanimous piece of feedback we received was that the students did not want to learn technology alongside content. So we designed an orientation prior to the start of the semester. Using the design thinking framework, we had students engage in a design challenge. The challenge was to design one aspect of their partner's study routine. Through this, they were going to get exposure to the different study tools they were using, but more importantly, they were going to get an opportunity to think about how to personalize those tools to how they learn best. You can read more about this at designingschools.org. And I'll link it for you in the show notes, where you can also download the activity and do it with your students as well. It's really a fantastic experience that's easy to facilitate and really helps to get to know your students on a deeper level. It's through these experiences at the University of Southern California where I really came to learn that cultures of innovation begin with a culture of empathy. I find that many of us open up to this way of thinking through experiences that we've had. After all, we're all wired for comfort and safety. It's easier to design with than it is to design for. So I asked Tom to share 2 inflection points that made him the incredible leader he is today.
Sure. So let me give you one quick example that jumps right to mind. I put myself back to being an elementary principal, and to share a quick story, it really shows how my mindset shifted because of my own lens shifting. When I was an elementary principal, my first year, I had a parent come to me and say, "Hey, Tom, listen, my daughter coming into second grade, she's got really severe food allergies related to peanuts. And I really need to pull together all the cafeteria people, the teacher, anybody that's going to have contact with her. I want just 15 minutes if I could. I want to explain something, share some signs." And, I was a brand new principal at the point. I'm like, "Sure, sounds good, Mom. Let's do it. We'll do it before the school year begins." We go ahead and do it. Everything went well. About a year later, Mom reaches back out. "Hey, Tom, it's me again, third grade this year. I want to pull everybody together." Part of me is honestly thinking to myself, well, we did it last year. My nurse knows, my instructional aides knows, but I'm like, all right, I want to help this mom, support this mom. We're going to go ahead and do it. Following year, my third year there, Mom reaches out again in the summer. "Hey, Tom, me again. Hope you're doing well. So, hey, want to pull everybody together." And I will tell you, my gut instinct was, "Mom, we know." Now I share that being very, very vulnerable, because it was that year my daughter was born. And I would find out soon after that my daughter had incredibly severe food allergies. My daughter would eventually be the one going to classroom parties. My daughter would be the one that I was worried if she doesn't get the help she needs in about a 30-minute window, it could be all over. It completely changed my mindset when I was the parent that was worried about my child's life when it came to being in a cafeteria. And I will tell you, talk about a humbling experience. Now, I never said we met that third year. I never expressed any frustration with Mom. I kept that professional face on. But if I'm totally vulnerable, that's some of the thoughts of my mindset of being like, "Mom, we've got this. We know it's okay." But then when it was me as dad, I was like, they need to be on it. There's no room for error. I've got to meet with them each year. And it just showed how quickly we can judge. It showed how quickly, like if we didn't have that lived experience, how we can wipe something like, "Oh, it's not that big of a deal. We know." But then when it was my baby girl, my mindset was like, there's no room for error here. And it was really, really humbling for me because I recognize like I can be quick to judge. I can be the person that's like, oh, that's not a big deal. But to that person's world, it's everything. In Personal and Authentic, I wrote how the difference between making a judgment and having empathy is understanding the story. And for me, when my story changed, my lens changed in the way that I saw that world. And so I think that's really one inflection point for me to recognize the leadership. The other piece that I will say, because you asked for two, I mentioned equity just a few moments ago. To be totally real and vulnerable, I grew up in a two-parent home in kind of middle-class America. We weren't wealthy, but we certainly weren't in poverty. I had new clothes on the first day of school. We went on vacation once a year. And so I had everything that I needed. And that lens, I didn't really understand early on as a teacher how fundamentally it was ingrained in me. I can remember thinking early on as a teacher, and then even sometimes as an administrator, sometimes thinking like, man, why isn't this kid getting their homework done? Like, why in the world doesn't the mom or dad like stay up and make sure and double check? And it's because that's what I had experienced in life. My parents would always make sure, hey, is your homework done? I want to see it. Let me double check. Or maybe it was the lunch bill that a child hasn't paid. And now I'm the middle school principal having this conversation with, I don't know, a 13-year-old. Hey, you got to pay that lunch. What's going on there? We can only give you this if you've got that debt. And I had never in my entire schooling career myself worried about not having lunch, my lunch money in my account. And so I share that very vulnerably to say it really took a lot of growth on my end and inflection to recognize not everybody has grown up the way that I did. Not everybody had that parent structure. In fact, the majority of our students did not. And so how, as a school leader, can I make sure to step out of my own way to recognize how do we have empathy for lenses that we've never experienced? And it's a real challenge, And so when I used my daughter example, going back to that, it took me going through a life experience to truly have empathy for what that mom was asking for. And so I think it's really important that we challenge our own lenses to recognize the way in which we see the world, our own story. And not that we need to feel guilty about that in any direction, but we've got to be really, really conscious that the students that we're serving have very different stories. And so we've got to have empathy for things that maybe we've never experienced.
Absolutely. And, you kind of remind me of how like there's that classic debate, right? Like, can you really just have empathy, right? Do you have to actually go through an experience to be able to kind of really see things from that lens? So I'm, again, just kind of curious, like what advice you give like to your leaders or strategies you use with people, because we can't obviously experience every single thing. Reflection, I think, is a huge part of it, which is why I love this question versus like about me. But I'm curious to hear from you, like what strategies do you use to be able to help people develop that lens?
Yeah. So one strategy I actually use actually comes from a counseling technique in my psychology background prior to is when I'm working with leaders, especially around equity or those types of things, I will actually have them map out their story. What I'll have them do is I'll have them take their life and kind of break it into thirds. And I'll give them a good period of time, maybe 5 to 7 minutes on kind of each third. And what I'll ask them to think about, take that first third of life from like birth through high school. And I want you to process, what are the life events? What are the things that you've gone through? What's any trauma? Or what are things that were so great that you remember 40 years later, 30 years later? I want you to brainstorm all of those. Sometimes people will put, hey, my parents went through a divorce. My father got fired. I still remember what that was like. And just these major life events. And then we'll take a look at that second part, college into early adulthood. Sometimes people will talk about, I remember having $12 in my bank account, having no idea how I was going to pay that rent. And they'll really put some things down there. And then to later in life where, hey, maybe it was the loss of a child or the birth of a child, and things are great. And it just gave them a different perspective. But when we map that out, what happens is everybody sitting side by side, their map looks very different. And so it's really the foundation of how do we recognize the differences? And not that one thing is better than another, they're just fundamentally different. Recognizing those differences and really taking a look at that really is the foundation of empathy and equity. It's recognizing we have things that others don't, and other people may have things that we don't. Celebrating those differences at times is and can be a really good thing. So that's one strategy that I'll use because, it's such also a fiery, hot topic right now across the country. You mentioned DEI or inclusion or equity, whatever it might be. And obviously school board meetings across the country are chaotic right now around these topics. But fundamentally, it comes down to every one of us has a story. Every one of us is unique. It's the reason in Personal and Authentic, I use this notion of fingerprints because they're all personal, right? They're all authentic in nature. The impact that we have on individuals are going to be different, even if we're in the same school on the same team. And that's a good thing, right? And so taking a look at that, recognizing differences, celebrating differences, to me is a really important inflection point. And that's a great starting point, in my opinion.
Community is an integral part of designing change. As I mentioned earlier, I'd been following along many of the stories of these schools because of the presence these leaders and schools had online. Despite not living in the community or being a part of that organization, I was able to get a front row seat into how they were navigating change prior to and during the pandemic. Every episode, we talk about leadership and social influence and how it helps build trust, inspire a collective vision, recognize accomplishments, and ultimately build a strong community. So I asked Tom to share the value he sees in leaders who invest in building social trust and influence.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is I see a humility with the leaders that I truly admire. They're sharing their story, but it's not look at me, it's look at our kids. Look what my teachers are doing. And so they share their story out. But the humility also relates to as good as you are, as much success as you've had as a district, there's always things to learn. There's always ways to meet kids' needs better. There's always opportunities to create. And so it's the humility plus the vulnerability to say, we can continue to get better. And as a superintendent, I'm going to lead the way and model the way. It's real easy the higher up you go to close our doors, close our community, and think every cabinet meeting is going to have all the answers for what we need and be totally blind to what's happening on the other side of the highway that are doing great things in different ways. And so I think what I'm seeing from a commonality is these leaders are willing to break down walls, share their stories, offer resources, offer support, offer ideas. Because so many times districts get pitted against each other in the newspaper. Well, that score, that graduation rate, whatever it might be. But recognizing how do we get to the point where we care as much about the kids across the highway as we do the kids in front of us, right? And when we can get to the pinnacle of that collaboration and we see superintendents working side by side, sharing things like professional learning, sharing ideas, networking on and working on things like pathways and those kinds of things together to break down traditional space and time barriers, kids win and kids benefit. And so what I see with so many of those leading superintendents is that humility, is that vulnerability, the willingness to share their story, not from this notion that we've arrived, check it off, look how good we are, but to highlight our kids and recognize that. And so I think that community building does go with sharing their own story, but also being vulnerable and recognizing the growth, but also recognizing the community partnerships that can really be a part of it. Some of these districts are just doing amazing things with their businesses, coming from out of California. Look at like linked learning and the things that are happening there. Look at some of the pathway programs that have been developed to really redesign high schools so it's uber relevant for that world. So what's happening is that community building is really building consensus. And then the next time something goes to a vote, they've got a lot more people that understand what's going on, that understand the relevance, that have been part of that process. And so that community building is helping when it comes to referendums and those things as well. It's not the ultimate reason of why you do it. We do it for our kids, but those are some of the side benefits when we make those networks, when we build those networks and make those connections.
No, absolutely. And for people who struggle with that idea, because it's hard, like, being vulnerable, building community, like that is a whole skill set in and of itself. What are some of the fears that you see from people and how do you kind of help them, I guess, navigate overcoming that?
The fear, especially at that level, the superintendent level, is you're always being watched. Every tweet, every post, no matter where you are, you're out to dinner with your family, you're on vacation, no matter where it is, you're always being watched. And so the higher up you go, there's always going to be this notion of some segment that doesn't like you for some reason. You want to minimize that number, but there's no leader out there that's making change that everybody across the way just thinks are the greatest thing on earth, right? And so some of that fear is recognizing, oh, what if I start sharing this out and what if it's not happening in this one classroom and somebody's calling me hypocritical because, right? And so I think part of the fear that comes down to it is repercussions from their board. Maybe I have even if it's just one board member that's following everything I do on social. And for some reason, they don't want me here. They think to be another superintendent. I start to become pretty hesitant in the things that I'm sharing, just thinking it's like that overanalyzation paralysis, right? That analysis paralysis, right? Where should I do that? Shouldn't I do it? And I think that's a natural fear because you are, as that leader, a public figurehead in that community. So to me, it's really, we just be intentional about it. Look at every lens, maybe networking with somebody else that you can say, hey, here's what I'm about to post. If I've got a concern, double check it for me. Am I missing something? Am I culturally blind when it comes to this post? Is there something that I need? And having, again, that humility and vulnerability to have somebody willing to check that, to have somebody to build some of those bridges there as well. It's absolutely a real fear when it comes to being that public servant. Doesn't matter if you're talking, somebody in government or you're talking about a school superintendent. And so I think to me, that's probably the biggest one that's out there.
Tom often talks about how our cultures are built on relationships and how these relationships should be personal and authentic. It's the title of his latest book, where he talks about how we can create these. At a time where teachers are feeling demoralized, I asked Tom what leaders should be considering so that they're intentional about building relationships that are personal and authentic with their teams.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to recognize education can be the loneliest place on the planet if we allow it to be. Whether I'm a superintendent or a teacher and my mindset is I'm going to close my own door and I'm going to do my own thing and I'm just going to kind of insulate myself from all of that, it can become a ridiculously lonely place. And the higher up you go, the more lonely it can become. So the first thing that I would say is you need to develop a network of support. You need to develop a network of people that can hold you accountable. You need to also develop a network of people that can look you in the eye and be like, are you sure you're not the problem here, in a loving way, not in a condescending way? Because it's easy for our lens to become very similar to those around us. So if I surround myself with 4 or 5 educators that everything that they do is going to be wrong and every day is terrible, and my principal is the most awful person in the world and whatever, like it's going to be pretty soon that I start joining in that conversation with very similar conversation. But if I surround myself with people that choose their lens differently each day, and I use that terminology very intentionally, choose their lens, it's not this notion of toxic positivity that some people use. It's not that notion. It's recognizing that it's my choice in how I see the world, and things are going to happen to me, but how I respond to it, that's up to me. That's not on somebody else, nor is it somebody else's responsibility. So when I look at that, we've got to be really intentional about creating networks of people that will love us no matter what, but will also push on us a little bit. I've got that. And actually, some of the relationships occurred through social media. A couple male friends of mine that I talk to literally on apps like Voxer, probably 10 times a day, going back and forth. They love me enough to be like, whack me upside the head if I need it, if my mindset's off, if they think that maybe I'm part of the issue. And I know it's done out of love and for the right reason. It's not done out of I'm better than or to be condescending. So my first thought would be, who are those accountability partners for you? Whether you're a teacher, whether you're a superintendent, where somebody can be real. And maybe it is picking up the phone and just saying, can I just talk about my day for a minute? Because I'm struggling. And they're not going to judge, right? If we don't have those people going at it alone, the work is virtually impossible. So if you're feeling like that, I would say, who are those people that have a slightly different lens than you? If I'm surrounding myself with people that are thinking just like me every single day, they're not really needed. And I don't read into that the wrong way, but how do I surround myself with diverse voices and people that see the world a little bit differently? So maybe I can recognize at times that it's my lens that can get in the way. And sometimes it is our own lens that gets in the way before we can redefine what's possible. And I think it's important to have the humility to recognize that. So I think that network is really important. I also am a really big proponent of intentional gratitude. Because we can look at each and every day of all the problems and all the struggles, and they're absolutely out there. I'm not saying we ignore them. But when I'm standing in front of 25 kids, the brilliance that's also in front of me every day, the creativity, the opportunity, the drive that's standing in front of me each and every day, I can choose to ignore it or I can choose to see it and do something about it. So this notion of intentional gratitude is something I actually learned a lot from Sean Aker. I love his work around this notion of intentional gratitude. And so looking at it and being really intentional each and every day to say, what's something I'm grateful for today? Who's somebody that I can build up? What's a random phone call I can make today just to tell somebody I'm thinking about them? I appreciate them. I know I haven't talked to them in a year. And then what happens to that person? How does that shift their day when they get that call, they get that text message, they get that note, that email, that handwritten note in their mailbox, totally out of the blue? And what I've learned is I also feel good in that process. Not only does it shift their lens or make their day or become that sunshine in a given day, I also feel good doing it. And so I think if we're really intentional about showing gratitude, I think it's really important. If I'm a teacher in a classroom, that can be to my students. It can be to my mentor. It can be across the teacher across the hall. It can be the support staff member who is a backbone to your classroom that comes in every single day so selflessly to support. And maybe it's even just a 2 or 3 minute conversation, just saying, hey, I just want to let you know, I really appreciate you, and being authentic about it and experience. So just a couple ideas there, but I'm really into the intentional gratitude to recognize and choosing my lens that I'm going to see the greatness each and every day, regardless of what's going on around me.
There's not a day that goes by where I'm not incredibly grateful for the online network I've developed over the past decade. It shifted the opportunities that I had access to. It allows me to wake up every day to a learning network where I'm informed of existing and emerging trends and where I can ask questions and get support if I need it. You'll often hear me share how leadership and social influence is a trending skill identified by the World Economic Forum. This is a topic that I'm probably asked the most questions about. I'm so excited to share with you that I'll be hosting a leadership and social influence masterclass in May. You can reserve your complimentary ticket at designingschools.org. During our time together, we'll explore how you can use social media to build trust, recognize accomplishments, inspire collective vision, and build an incredible network that will change how you view your profession and the opportunities that you have access to. I'll be joined by Michael Hernandez. He's worked with Apple, Adobe, Google, National Geographic, and PBS over the past 2 decades to help adults and young people learn the art and craft of storytelling. We cannot wait to see you there.
So, I would just say, I just want to give an intentional thank you to the educators who pour their lives into other people's kids, who often stare at the ceiling at night, going to bed sleepless nights because of other people's children, and just recognizing the goodness that's out there in the midst of such chaos and adversity. Fear, in the words of Zig Ziglar, can mean that we are going to forget everything and run. And in the middle of a pandemic, sometimes we can understand that. But fear can also mean, according to Zig Ziglar, that we're going to face everything and rise. And I continue to see that each and every day in classrooms, in district offices, as people provide the stability, as they provide the calm, as they look to shift experiences to create great opportunities for kids. And so I'd love to end by just saying thanks to those that are working with kids each and every day, that are in the trenches, truly transforming lives.
It's your turn to join the conversation by sharing what you enjoyed or what questions you have. In a world where time and attention are so valuable, thank you for choosing to listen and for being a part of our Designing Schools community. Leaving a review for the podcast helps others learn about the show, giving them the gift of knowledge and allowing this community to help create access and exposure to ideas and opportunities others may not even know exist.